Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of Side Projects. This one is all about the Rosetta Stone, bringing ancient Egypt back to life. Maybe this should be on the Mega Projects channel. This feels like a fairly big deal, but here it is on Side Projects, so enjoy. Also, I've seen the Rosetta Stone, and it's way bigger than you think. It's massive, like this sort of size, and they have one in the British Museum. You can touch it, because they've made like a replica of it. It's cool. Definitely go to see it if you're in London. In 1799, French soldiers discovered something that would end up changing humanity's view of the past and finally unlocked the history of ancient Egypt. Its discovery made Egyptology a thing, and its very name is now used as a term to mean something that can decode the previously incomprehensible. We're talking, of course, about the Rosetta Stone. Already spoiled that one with my pre-intro intro. Carved out of a large slab or stele of granodiorite in 196 BC, the Rosetta Stone would originally have been about 149 centimeters high. The surviving piece, found by the French, measures 114 centimeters at its highest point and is 72 centimeters wide. If you're wondering how its name came about, it was found at a site in Rosetta, or modern-day Rashid, in Egypt's Nile Delta. Napoleon's army was campaigning in Egypt at the end of the 18th century, but it was not going particularly well. While they were working on strengthening a fort in Rosetta, soldiers came upon the piece of the stone within the walls. Seemingly, it had been used as just general building material. Spotting the intriguing carvings, Lieutenant Pierre-François Bouchard realized that it could be of historical value, and the stone was carefully excavated. The French soldiers could immediately see that this was something unusual, as the inscriptions were clearly in 3 different languages. The first section contained 14 lines of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. The second, most complete section contained 32 lines of Egyptian Demotic script, although it was originally thought to be Syriac. The last section was made up of 53 lines of ancient Greek. It was assumed correctly that the 3 sections were translations of the same text. This is the crux of how the Rosetta Stone became synonymous with translation and unlocking new knowledge, as at that point, at the very end of the 18th century, hieroglyphics were a complete mystery and had not been understood for over 1,000 years. Prior to the end of the Pharaonic period, hieroglyphics had been in use for over 2,000 years, but they gradually became more associated with the rulers and elite of the country, so they fell out of common usage. After Egypt fell to Rome, the Roman alphabet gradually took over, and after a few centuries, knowledge of hieroglyphs had been totally lost. Here, finally, was a chance of working out what all those symbols meant. The stone was sent to Cairo, where copies of the text were made and passed around to the biggest linguistic brains in Europe to see who could be the first to crack the hieroglyphic code. In 1801, and totally going against form, the French finally surrendered to the British, and as well as a lot of the other loot they'd found in Egypt, they also gave up possession of what was then already known as the Rosetta Stone. By 1802, the Rosetta Stone was in the British Museum, where you can still see it today. Like I said, it's worth doing, and more copies of the text have been sent to scholars in Oxford, Cambridge, Edinburgh, and Dublin. The Rosetta Stone had a nice big chunk of ancient Greek at the bottom, which was translatable by 19th century scholars. It did take a while for a decent translation to come about, however, as the source text itself was pretty dense and formal, and there weren't many other contemporary sources that had been found yet for comparison. So, what was revealed once this section was translated? Well, turns out it's pretty boring, actually. Say the word decree, and you know you're going to be in for a world of official language and legalese. In essence, the text refers to King Ptolemy V, and it talks about all the great things he'd done since his coronation the year before. At the end, it also goes on to say that the decree should be disseminated every year and written in sacred characters, i.e. hieroglyphics that were only really used by the pharaohs, priests, and Egyptian nobility. It also had to be written in native characters, which refers to the Egyptian Demotic script in the middle, which was a more general usage language at the time, and Greek characters, which is what the scholars managed to translate first. These decrees were supposed to be set up in temples across the land, meaning that the Rosetta Stone is one of possibly thousands of copies. Other examples of similar decrees have since been found, giving the impression that these slabs were the ancient Egyptian equivalent of a multilingual flyer you'd probably put straight into the recycling bin. According to the British Museum, an earlier prototype of the text of the stone has also been found, the only difference between them being the names of the ruler and the dates. This makes it much easier to understand why the stone was found propping up the fort walls. On its own, at the time, it was not an important object and was of far more use being recycled as building materials. The next step for historians and scholars was to understand the rest of the text on the stone. They knew what it was supposed to say, they just needed to work out how it was saying it. Concurrent with the translation of the Greek text, Johann David Ackerblad and Antoine Isaac Sylvestre de Sacy were working on the demotic section. They did fairly well on this, working out a few names and a 29-letter alphabet, although not all of the letters turned out to be correct. The rest of the symbols had them stumped, though, and they ended up giving up. Now enter Thomas Young, who, while not managing to crack the code entirely, at least began fashioning the key to the lock. In 1814, he worked out that the demotic script wasn't totally alphabetical and that some of the characters were symbols, meaning that the text was a mixture of sounds and images. He then turned his attention to the hieroglyphic section of the stone, but in a move that almost sent him straight into historical obscurity, he did not twig that the hieroglyphics might also be a mixture of phonetic and symbolic characters. It was not entirely his fault, however. Historians had accepted the fact that hieroglyphics were almost totally symbolic due to a book by Horapollo from about the 5th century AD. No other evidence had ever contradicted this, so using this incorrect assumption as a base for their translations didn't get anybody very far. Thomas Young did manage to figure out some names from the hieroglyphic section due to them being in cartouches or ovals enclosing a set of symbols. He worked out that these were phonetic spellings of, for example, Ptolemy. Once again, his brain just failed to make that final leap, and he thought that phonetics were only used for names. After that, he couldn't make any more progress and eventually gave up. Finally, after corresponding with Young, comparing texts from other Egyptian sources and noting similarities between Greek names and the same names in hieroglyphics, Egyptophile Jean-François Champollion worked out that hieroglyphics were not, in fact, purely symbolic. In a letter to a friend in 1822, he wrote, "It is a complex system, writing figuratively, symbolic, and phonetic all at once in the same text, the same phrase. I would almost say in the same word." This revelation spurred him on, and in about 1824, 25 years after the Rosetta Stone was discovered, scholars finally had a working knowledge of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. Champollion set off to read the inscriptions on the ancient tombs firsthand in 1828, confirming and building on his knowledge of hieroglyphics. Although he damaged some tombs himself and even carved his own name onto a pillar in the Karnak complex, the light that he shed on the past was enough that he became known as the founding father of Egyptology. Since 1802, the Rosetta Stone has been kept in the British Museum in London. The museum had to build a whole new gallery to display it since the combined weight of the stone and assorted other Egyptian loot nearly caused the original display room's floor to collapse. The Rosetta Stone has only been moved once since then, and that was in 1917 during the First World War. Due to fears about being bombed, the British Museum moved the stone and other assorted important bits and bobs to an underground tube station, and it stayed there for 2 years before being put back on display. You may have already heard that the stone is a basalt slab. This came about because the museum wanted the public to see and actually touch the stone. The inscriptions were chalked over to really make them pop, and a layer of dark wax was put over the stone to protect it. This made it look darker than it actually was underneath. This coating was eventually cleaned off, and the Rosetta Stone now sits in a glass case in the British Museum's Egyptian Sculpture Gallery alongside sculptures of King Ramesses II and King Amenhotep III. Understandably, Egypt has asked for the repatriation of the Rosetta Stone, or at least the chance to borrow it for a few years. The British Museum has given these requests an unequivocal no, citing vague reasons such as the worldwide appeal of objects such as this and the fact that it's basically had it for ages and just doesn't want to give it up. They did send a lovely fiberglass replica to the Rashid National Museum in 2005, but it seems that that's as good as it's going to get. Living up to the idioms it spawns, the Rosetta Stone was what enabled a whole civilization to be rediscovered and understood in its own language, which is not too shabby for what is, in essence, a mass-produced bit of jargon. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe. Also, if you want more content like this, why not subscribe to the sister channel for this channel that I mentioned at the beginning, Mega Projects. It is linked to below, and thank you for watching.